Question number 2 is, what key events sharpened the divisions between Britain and the colonists in the late 1760s and early 1770s? The first is a law or a series of laws called the Townshend Acts that were passed in 1767. These taxed certain imports, among them lead, paper, paint, glass, and tea, all basic items that colonists tended to use pretty regularly. In opposition to these acts, colonists resumed their non-importation movement and the popular protests, very similar to what had been seen during their resistance to the Stamp Act. And also we see colonist communities unite to produce their own goods through the so-called homespun movement. The key event was the Boston Massacre in 1770. This started as a conflict between colonial dock workers and British soldiers over jobs. British soldiers in their downtime could actually get a job wherever they were stationed, and they oftentimes worked for lower wages than the people who lived there would. So British soldiers who were off duty were taking work as dock workers and taking work away from colonial dock workers. There was a confrontation outside one of these dock houses. British troops will open fire to disperse the crowd, and it will kill 5 Bostonians. And the event is very highly dramatized by Paul Revere's widely circulated print that you see here that really portrays the event as something much bloodier and more horrible than it actually was. The Townshend Acts will eventually be repealed under pressure. However, the Parliament will leave in place the tax on tea. The tax on tea will become the Tea Act. Here, the East India Tea Company, which was a British government-owned company, was allowed to unload low-priced tea on the colonies in an effort to save the flailing company's business. Colonists, however, saw buying this low-priced tea from the East India Tea Company as an acceptance of Parliament's right to tax without the colony's consent. The result, the Tea Act, is of course met with resistance. Famously, the Boston Tea Party will dump 300 chests of British East India Tea Company's tea into the Boston Harbor at a great financial loss to the East India Tea Company, which would amount to about $4 million in today's money. In response to the Boston Tea Party, Parliament is going to pass the so-called coercive acts. And the coercive acts are actually referred to as the intolerable acts by the colonists because they are simply too restrictive and too harsh to be tolerated. Nonetheless, the coercive or intolerable acts first closed Boston Harbor until Boston repaid the price of the tea that had been dumped into the harbor. Secondly, it restructured Massachusetts' government to give more power to the royal governor over the colonial assembly. Third, it quartered a garrison of troops in Boston, meaning that a lot of these soldiers would have to be housed in colonists' homes, which they saw as a violation of their privacy. Finally, the Quebec Act was part of the coercive acts. This didn't really have a lot to do with the Boston Tea Party, but nonetheless, it frightened a lot of colonists because it allowed for the toleration of Catholicism in Canada. And anti-Catholic sentiment was common throughout the colonies and will continue to be common throughout most of U.S. history because many of the colonists and later Americans, they associate their Americanness with being Protestant. So the Quebec Act is threatening to many colonists because they believe it may allow for the encroachment of Catholics into the colonies if it's allowed in Canada.